we would probably all agree that sport is something which should be accessible to all people. And I think we need to probably start asking the question of, is it so available? Are there some people who have less access to sport? And if so, who are those people? And in today's recording, I'm going to sort of start asking this question about people who experience disability. Now, I use that term very deliberately. I don't want to talk about people who are disabled, because there's a very fine line between a person who is disabled themselves or a person who is being disabled by our society. And I think we need to sort of have that clear in our minds from the start. But really what we're going to talk about today is the impact of disability on sporting participation. Okay, so wherever the source of that disability is, what is the likely impact on participation for an individual or for groups in society because of that notion of disability? So let's sort of start that off right from the get-go with some kind of relevant discussion about the level of ability or disability of somebody. Okay, the level of ability or disability. Your exam board, in this case OCR, want you to be aware that depending on how disabled somebody is, they might have more or less access to sport. Well, that might be the case. That might be true, right? If someone has no movement in their body apart from the movement of their head or their eyelids or some muscles in their cheek, then that's going to apparently limit them to taking part in sport, right? Well, yes and no, it can do that. But if we structure our sport in a specific way to allow that person access and provide that person with the support that they need, then they're no longer disabled, right? So although this is a point, level of ability, disability, which will get you a mark on your exam board, it's a point I would really encourage you to challenge. Look, my first ever coaching job was with a young man who I sort of kind of described a moment ago. The only movement he had in his entire body was he could slightly move his head to the left and to the right, and he had these little touch sensors on his specially designed wheelchair which allowed him to communicate that way. You might think, well, that person can't do sport, right? He can't possibly be a sports person. But we played games of bocce where I would be his assistant. I would sit facing away from the play. He would indicate to me through his computer which direction, which weight he wanted that ball to be rolled down ramp, and I would release that ball together with him by placing his hand on the ball. He was ableized because of the structure we had. So I'd encourage you to challenge this idea, this level of ability, disability. If society ableizes people, then they're no longer disabled. Right? Anyway, we're getting a little bit philosophical here, but you get the idea. How disabled somebody is, or how disabled society makes somebody, might impact on their participation. The other thing that I think is really crucial here is what we might say societal views. Look, until 2012, something like the Paralympic movement was a very sort of subdued, secondary level, second tier sporting experience, right? Now it's in the mainstream, or I hope it is, or certainly more so. So societal views seem to be changing. But certainly societal views traditionally have been quite discriminatory towards disability sport. It's sort of secondary, it's not important. It's almost a joke, discriminatory sport. And I'm saying that today we're bringing it more into kind of like a normalisation process, although obviously someone like Oscar Pistorius has got a rather horrid recent past. As I record this in 2014, his breaking into the Olympic Games, into, in inverted commas, able-bodied Olympic Games, was quite a feat, right? I mean, it actually changed a lot of people's opinions about what the notion of able-bodiment was. So societal views are important, but perhaps they're changing. Don't forget that societal views also have an impact on people who are experiencing disabilities themselves. So we have to say that the concept of esteem and self-confidence is really important for people who experience disabilities. If you are an amputee, or you are wheelchair bound, or if you're experiencing some kind of learning difficulties, do you recognise yourself that you have a place and a home in sport and physical activity? Or is it a thing that kind of puts you off, right? I mean, it's a good question. Would somebody see themselves being comfortable and welcomed and warmly brought into an environment of sport? Do you see yourself? Do you see yourself in that environment? Do you see yourself in that environment? It's a good question to ask. And that doesn't just relate to disability, right? I mean, that also relates to aspects of sort of socio-economic status, gender, age? Do you see yourself in that environment? If we don't, then this esteem is a barrier, and one that perhaps we need to go about trying to change and challenge if we can. Some kind of provision aspects now. What about a lack of coaches? What about a lack of a coach who can coach you, even though you're not, in inverted commas, able-bodied? Are these people available to everyone who is experiencing a disability? Is that there? If it's not, then it's going to be a barrier to participation, right? And one that needs to be challenged. So are those coaches available? Furthermore, it's not just coaches, is it? What about a lack of specialist equipment, right? I mean, when we talk about things like specialist equipment, people often talk about things like access and ramps. I don't think I mean that so much. I think that's less and less of an issue in the modern world, but I'm sure it is still an issue in some places, but I think in UK society that's largely been dealt with. But what I do think is important is, has a sport actually incorporated people of different body types into the playing of that particular activity? And does it allow the adaptation of equipment to actually achieve that? Okay, if it hasn't, then that is a limitation for people, and one again that we might need to go about challenging. What then about this idea? Is there club availability? Is there, for example, near you a wheelchair rugby or basketball club? If there's not, then that's a lack of opportunity. I guarantee you there'll be basketball clubs and rugby clubs for people who don't use wheelchairs, but are there for people who do? And don't forget, something like wheelchair rugby isn't just for people whose legs don't work, it's for all people. But is it available to us in the levels that other activities are? The answer normally is no, and that of course becomes a barrier and a restriction. Oh, excuse me, a little bit of gas coming up there. Just drank a coffee. I do apologise. What an off-putting thing for your learning and your revision, me burping down the microphone. Anyway, we've also got to think about the idea of transport. Can we say that something like cars are less accessible and tend to be less used by people who experience disabilities? Obviously, I know that there's loads of people who might be experiencing disability who drive perfectly normally and well. But in general terms, is transport an issue? Do we actually have access to the same level of transport as this somehow spurious notion of able-bodied person does? The answer might be no, and if the answer is no, it's a limitation. What about this one? This is a really interesting one. What about the idea of role models? Are there just as many role models for people who are experiencing disability compared to those who apparently aren't? The answer is probably no. But this has been challenged, right? I mean, think about people. I've talked about David Weir loads of times in my videos before. But think about the difference it has made in the UK with the 2012 Games, the Olympics and the Paralympics. I think that really went about changing some attitudes and providing sport and role models that weren't just this kind of homogenised, able-bodied kind of picture of health. I mean, this Paralympic movement and the media coverage, which I think was so much better during the 2012 Games, particularly the Channel 4, the Channel 4 media coverage was so good, and it really challenged some dominant assumptions about disability sport, right? I think that was a really positive thing and a good example of how we can actually challenge and change these kind of considerations. But that coverage, we do see a lot less disability or Paralympic sport on our TVs and our newspapers online than we do for something like, we do for like able-bodied sport or football or cricket and all these kind of notions. By the way, the same stuff applies to gender inequality as well, right? This isn't just disability inequality. What about gender inequality? You can ask the same questions about all of those things. Same points would apply, right? I mean, it's absolutely the case, maybe with the exception of lack of specialist equipment. But other than that, almost exactly the same points. And finally, I'm going to I haven't got much room here, so I'll spread this out here. What about the idea of inclusion? Do we have the idea of inclusion in institutions such as schools? Do schools develop not just sport, but disability and Paralympic sport? Do they have the clientele, the people attending their school, to actually achieve that? Do they have the kind of the desire and the want and the need to actually say, well, look, this exists and it's real and it's just as important, therefore we're going to improve it and develop it? And I think the answer to that is often no. It's not out of horribleness that people don't provide these things. I look at my own background as a PE teacher. I don't think I've really done a very good job at having an inclusive kind of atmosphere around sporting clubs and extracurricular and lessons and so on. I think it's been pretty average. Could I have done that better? Yeah, probably I could. And I think it's not a deliberate thing, but it's based on a series of assumptions that we make about what sport is like and what it should be like. Again, the same point refers with regards to gender inequality in sport. You can ask the same point, right? I mean, it's the same. We tend to provide more clubs, more opportunities, more facilities, more coaches for men's sport than we do for women. That discourages women perhaps as well, and leads to a lack of esteem. Exactly the same point, just as it does with Paralympic or disability sport. Okay, some contentious things there. I think as a summary, I would ask you really to think about what disables somebody. I'm actually going to ask that question. It's not going to get you marks in your exam. It's what disables somebody. And I really encourage you to talk about this in your classes, right, or with your friends. What disables somebody? Is disability something that we have because this guy is missing this bottom part of his leg? Is that a disablement? Or is it that, this guy is now not disabled because we've developed and advanced the idea of bladed technology that can be used to supplement a lower leg amputee, for example? What disables somebody? Is this person disabled now with this blade? We could argue that they're not. Well, why should anyone be disabled if we could actually supplement people's physiology and biology and give them opportunities? Does disablement actually exist within a person, or is it a societal condition? Is it a societal condition? And it's something kind of controversial, but you should think about it because it's a really important thing, I think, for our current society. Okay, I hope I haven't confused you too much. Someone kind of passionate about all this stuff, and encourage you to think about it. Cheers.